Okay, so in a previous lesson, we talked about solving a quadratic equation by factoring. So what we did, if you recall, is notice that this is a difference of two squares. We put it in standard form, so this is in standard form. It is a difference of two squares, so I get x minus 6 times x plus 6 equals 0. And then remember, we use the zero factor property, so zero factor property. And we set, and remember the zero factor property says that if you have two or more factors whose product is 0, then what has to happen is that one of them has to be 0. So we set both of these equal to 0. So we get x minus 6 equals 0, x plus 6 equals 0. And so notice you went from a quadratic equation to two linear. And so when you solve those two linear, you get x to be 6 and x to be negative 6. All right, and so you have these two solutions, 6 and negative 6, and you always check yourself. 6 squared is 36, 36 minus 36 is 0, negative 6, so x squared means x times x, so negative 6 times a negative 6 is a 36, 36 minus 36 is 0. Now the way we wrote the answer was there are several ways you can write it. You can say x equals 6, x equals negative 6, or you can say something like, since they're opposites of each other, you could say x equals plus or minus 6. Doesn't matter. Okay? All right, now, the other thing that you saw on a previous test in terms of solving by factoring was suppose you had this. Suppose you had x squared equal 25. And remember, you must read the directions. So the direction says solve by factoring, then you have to use factoring. So what we did, just like this, it had to be in standard form, so we rewrite it, so we get x squared minus 25 equals 0, so it's now in standard form. This is the difference of two squares, so I factor it, I get x minus 5 times x plus 5 equals 0. And then we use the zero factor property again, so we say each of these factors equal to 0. So I get x minus 5 equals 0, x plus 5 equals 0. And notice I went from a quadratic to two linear, and we just solve each of those linear equations. So I get x equal 5, x equal negative 5. And so your solutions then would be x equal 5, x equal negative 5, or x equal plus or minus 5. Now in my math lab, the way you wrote it, they told you separating by commas. So you said x equal, and didn't matter which one you put first, 5 comma negative 5. All right, now in this lesson we want to talk about the square root property. So we want to talk about solving quadratic equations using the square root property. So solve quadratic equations using the square root property. Okay, square root property. Okay, so the way that's going to work is this. All right, let's start with a simple example. Suppose I had x squared equal, let's say, 64. X squared equals 64. And you want to solve this quadratic equation. And you want to solve this by using the square root property. So we solve by using square root property. Not by factoring, but by square root property. So always read the directions. Okay, so basically you're asking yourself, see the variables on the left and it's being squared. So you're asking yourself, what number times itself is 64? So most of you probably said 8. That is true. So one of my solutions is 8, because 8 times 8 is 64. But some of you didn't notice that another solution is a negative 8, because negative 8 times a negative 8 is also a positive 64. So not only is 8 times 8 a 64, but also negative 8 times negative 8 is a 64. So my solutions, these are your solutions, so the solutions would be plus or minus 8, or x equal 8 negative 8, or you can say x equal plus or minus 8. All right, now, so basically what happened was this. So I'm going to rewrite this problem. So x squared equals 64. Now here's the idea you're going to use. Remember, you're solving for x. Right now I'm squaring You see you have x squared. So I'm squaring x, so you got to do the opposite. The opposite of squaring is to take the square root. So it looks something like this. So what you do to one side, you do to the other. And remember the square root of 64 is 8. But remember there are two solutions, a positive and a negative. So when you take the square root of both sides, right here, you're going to put a plus or minus. So that becomes plus or minus square root of 64. Now, remember you're squaring. To undo squaring, you're going to square root. So these undo each other. So notice those that means they're undoing each other. So all you're left with is x. So I get x equal plus or minus the square root of 64. Simplifying the square root of 64. Don't leave it like this because remember you got to simplify. And notice that 64 is a perfect square. So we get plus or minus 8. So that's your answer. So x equals plus or minus 8. And so the square root property, if you really want to look at it in terms of letters, square root property basically says this. If b is a real number, if b is a real number, and if a squared equal b, if a squared equal b, then a is going to equal plus or minus the square root of b. So basically right here, you're going to take the square root of both sides. You can say plus or minus. The square and the square root undo each other, so you get a equal plus or minus square root of b. So that's what this is. All right. So remember though, in order to use the square root property, so you got to look at a form. At the form, how it's supposed to look. If you're going to use the square root property, it has to look something like this. Something squared equal a number. You want a number on the other side. You have something squared equal a number. And that coefficient right here needs to be a 1. So that should be a 1. Okay? All right, so keep that in mind as we go through the process. So this is the form. Form must look like this when using the square root property. Okay, so something squared equal a number, and that coefficient right here has to be a 1. So if it's a 2, you divide both sides by 2. If it's a 3, divide both sides by 3. All right, so we're going to do one like that in a little while. Okay, so this is going to be right here. This is going to be part A. So we're going to do this in 2 parts. So part A. All right, so let's suppose we had x squared. So we're going to solve each of these. Solve each. So it's going to solve by using the square root property. All right, number 1. We have x squared equal 45. So x squared equal 45. So notice it is of the form, remember, going like this, something squared equal a number, and that's what that looks like, something squared equal a number. All right, so once it's by itself, then remember the square root property. The square root property says this. If something squared equal a number, then the radicand here, the base must equal plus or minus the square root of b here. All right, so basically you're saying this. You're saying, all right, if x squared equal 45, then I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And when I take the square root of both sides, I need to remember to do that plus or minus. So the square and the square root, they undo each other. So I get x equal plus or minus the square root of 45. But remember, though, you have to simplify this. You have to simplify this. So when I simplify the square root of 45, I'm going to get square root of 9 times 5. So that's going to, the square root of 9 is 3. So I'm going to get 3 square root of 5. And so the answer is going to be x equal plus or minus 3 square root of 5. Now don't forget there are 2 solutions. So don't forget. So one's a positive 3 square root of 5. And the other is a negative 3 square root of 5. So either one of these is fine. Just know that this is more of a compact form than this is. So you wrote these as 2 separate solutions, and this you wrote it as, these are 2 different solutions, but you wrote it in a more compact form. All right, so that's number one. Number two, all right, suppose you had, let's see, suppose you had x squared minus 12 equals 0. X squared minus 12 equals 0. Okay, so you want to make sure, first of all, that you put in this form something squared equal number because you want to use the square root property. So you got to get that x squared by itself. So get x squared by itself, you get x squared equal 12, and then we're going to do it just like we did this one. So you're going to take the square root of both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus. So the square and the square root will undo each other. So you get x equal plus or minus the square root of 12. And then simplifying the square root of 12, I'm going to get the square root of 4 times 3. And the square root of 4 here is 2. So you get 2 square root of 3. And so the answer is plus or minus 2 square root of 3. Number 3. All right, suppose you had, let's see, suppose you had 5x squared minus 55 equals 0. So 5x squared minus 55 equal 0. All right, well, again, remember, I got to get in this form. So if I'm going to use the square root property, if I want to use the square root property, I got to get something squared equal a number where this thing right here involves the variable x. Okay, so the base here must have x in it. And on the other side must only be a number, a real number. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is bring the 55 over. So I'm going to get 5x squared equal 55. Then I get x squared by itself. Remember earlier we said that when you get this, whenever you have it in the form something squared equal number, this number right here, the coefficient out here, must be 1. So right now it's not a 1, it's a 5. So I got to divide both sides by 5. So don't forget to do that because you want to get x squared by itself. So divide both sides by 5. And then 5 divided by 5 is 1. 1 times x squared equal 11. That's where I'm at. And then finally, you're going to take the square root of both sides. Because right now you're squaring, the opposite of squaring is to take the square root. So both sides. But remember, when you take the square root of both sides, you get plus or minus. So the square and the square root undo each other. So you get x equal plus or minus square root of 11. And so that's what you get. Number 4. All right, number 4, suppose you had, all right, suppose you had this. Suppose you had x squared plus 25 equals 0. X squared plus 25 equals 0. All right, so remember you got to get the x squared by itself. So I get x squared equal a negative 25. And remember, I'm trying to get x by itself now. Right now I'm squaring x, so the opposite is take the square root of both sides, just like this. Remember, you're taking the square root of a negative 25. But don't forget, when you take the square root of both sides, you get plus or minus. And so the square and the square root undo each other, so you get x equal plus or minus the square root of a negative 25. And don't forget, you're taking the square root of a negative number, so don't forget that I. So the answer is going to be, let's remember this. So remember, the square root of negative 25 is 5i. So you get x equal plus or minus 5i. So there's your answer there. Number 5, suppose you had 3x squared equal a negative, let's say 15. So 3x squared equal a negative 15. I can't take the square root just yet, square root of both sides, because you remember you want this to be a 1 right here. Now technically you can, but you're not going to get the right answer very easily. So be careful. Get x squared by itself. So first thing we're going to do is divide both sides by 3. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this. So you divide both sides by 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1. 1 times x squared equal, and that's going to be negative 5. Now to get x by itself, remember you're going to take the square root of both sides. Now remember you take the square root of both sides. Don't forget this is square root of negative 5. Get plus or minus. The square and the square root undo each other. So you get x equal plus or minus Now let's figure out what the square root of negative 5 is. So remember, square root of negative 5 means the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 5. So that's I, square root of negative 1 is I, square root of 5. So I get plus or minus I square root of 5. All right, number 6. Suppose you had, let's see. All right, suppose you had this. Suppose you had number 6. Suppose you had negative 2x squared equal 40. Negative 2x squared equal 40. So remember, if you're going to use the square root property to get x by itself, you have to first of all make sure that x squared is by itself. So you got to first of all make sure that you divide both sides by this negative 2. So I get divide both sides by negative 2. Negative 2 divided by negative 2 is 1. 1 times x squared is x squared. So I get x squared equal to negative 20. And now I'll get x squared by itself. So remember, to have that form, something squared equal a number. So then you can take the square root of both sides. Something squared equal a number. So you take the square root of both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus. So basically, you're going to say this. Square root of both sides. Plus or minus. The square and the square root undo each other. So you get x equal plus or minus the square root of a negative 20. Now we just got to figure out what the square root of a negative 20 is. So simplifying this. That's the square root of a negative 1 times 20. Square root of a negative 1 to the square root of 20. This is I, square root of 20. Simplifying the square root of 20, that's going to be I. Now you could skip some of these steps, but that's going to be I times, all right, 20. The perfect square in there is 4. So you get 4 times 5. So I'm going to get, and the square root of 4 is 2. So we have 2I square root of 5. And that goes here. So x equal plus or minus 2I square root of 5. All right, so that's what I get. Let's see. Suppose you had, let's do one more. All right, suppose you had this. We had 3x squared minus 9 equal 0. 3x squared minus 9 equal 0. So again, if you want to use the square root property, you got to get x squared by itself. And so to get x squared by itself, I'm going to bring the 9 over. I'm bring the negative 9 to the other side. So I'm going to add 9 to both sides. So negative 9 and 9 is 0. I get 3x squared equal 9. Remember, you got to get x squared by itself, so I divide both sides by 3. Just like this. So 3 divided by 3 is 1. 1 times x squared is x squared. 9 divided by 3 is 3. And then to get x by itself, right now I'm squaring. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. I'll get plus or minus though. And so the square and the square root undo each other. So you get x equal plus or minus square root of 3. All right. And so that is part 1, part A rather. And then we're going to look at another part of this.